Happy Black History Month. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us on our panel discussion called Navigating the Black Kaleidoscope of Language and Culture. Languages are the gateway to knowledge, and across the Black diaspora, we travel from across the Black diaspora. In this panel, we will travel from the past, reflecting on its legacies, the present, reflecting on our current experiences, and the future to reflect on how Black language is shaping. Our esteemed panel provides a variety of disciplines to help understand the social historical legacies of languages across the Black diaspora. Joining me today, if you can give a warm welcome, are Courtney Overton, who is the owner and founder of Speech of Cake, a private practice that specializes in treating speech, sound disorders, dyslexia, dysgraphia. This is where dyslexia comes in. Dysgraphia. For the past few days, Courtney has advocated for neurodiverse students and students of color by providing seminars and workshops and keynotes on a national level. Just to clarify, I'm dyslexic, so that's why I couldn't pronounce that word properly. But anyway, the second panelist is Dr. Emmanuel Ngué Um, who works to strengthen the languages of Cameroon and to create digital resources for African languages. Emmanuel is currently working to revitalize the language of Bassa, which is spoken in Cameroon. Our third panelist is Professor Eva Michelle Wheeler. She is a social cultural linguist whose work frames languages as lens for interdisciplinary inquiry. Her research questions have explored the constructs of ideas about race, beauty, and the meaning in Spanish-speaking settings in the US, Latin America, Europe, and Central Africa. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Francesca Sobande, is a lecturer, researcher, and writer who explores the power and politics of media and the marketplace, including issues concerning identity, intersecting inequalities, and imagination. Her research particularly focuses on digital remix culture, Black diaspora archives, feminism, creative work, pop and culture, and devolved nations. Our fifth and final panelist is Tarcizio Silva, a researcher and activist technologist focused in promoting racial justice and decolonial thinking about technology. Tarcizio is also a Tech and Society Mozilla Fellow. He is collaborating with Archivio Educative and a network of technologists to promote awareness and knowledge on the issues around anti-racism and the politics of technologies. So welcome, panelists. So as we begin our conversation, I would like to ask the first question to Dr. Emmanuel. How would you describe the relationships people have with their mother tongues in post-colonial contexts?
Thank you so much, Hillary. Thank you to my co-panelists. Well, speaking about the post-colonial context, let me remind our audience that Cameroon, where I'm speaking from, was colonized first by Germany and secondly by France and the British within the framework of a joint trusteeship. So the type of relationships that people may have with their mother tongue in post-colonial settings may differ. But in the particular case of French colonization, there was overt intention by the French rule, the French colonial rule, to erase the cultural memory of the people in their colonies. And more than 60 years after independence, we must acknowledge that cultural erasure is at work. I personally have been beaten because I was speaking my mother tongue at school, even though I did not know to speak any other language. So from the generation of my parents down to the generation of my children, we have grown, we have been taught to despise our languages, and we have developed negative representations about our language. Or I would prefer to call them our ancestor languages, because in some cases, the concept of mother tongue may not just apply because these languages are no mother tongue to many, especially the generation of my children. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your response and the acknowledgement of like Cameroon's history. And I really like the point you were sharing about like looking at, rather than mother tongues, ancestral tongues, and like tying that relationship, because I resonate with it so much as someone from the Kenyan diaspora. Another question that I have for our second panelist, Courtney, which is quite close to home as a neurodivergent babe, is the question of what are the societal and political legacies of ableism towards people with speech pathologies and or neurodivergencies? How do these processes connect with racism?
Yeah, so most speech language pathologists, or as we call ourselves, SLPs, work in the school system, and they have the power to diagnose and treat communication disorders like difficulty pronouncing different sounds or language deficits. And while most SLPs work in the schools, most SLPs are also white women. And speech language pathology has the reputation of being the fourth whitest job in America, according to an article published in The Atlantic a few years ago. So this means that, you know, most times the race or the ethnicity of the SLP does not match the race or the ethnicity of their caseload, the students that they meet with. So this leads to a disparity between the provider and the student. And that leads to serious, real concerns around representation and cultural awareness. And that impacts the therapy services that speech language pathologists provide to Black students. So most SLPs work in the schools, as I said, and they mostly speak the most popular form of English in the United States, which is called mainstream American English. But most of their Black students will be speaking African American English, otherwise known as AAE. And a lot of people don't know that AAE is a systematic, rule-governed, logical, fully formed language variety, and it does differ significantly from other varieties or dialects of English. So specifically with phonology, which are the sound systems of language, there's phonological rules that must be followed in AAE too. So you might hear an AAE speaker say mother, while an MAE speaker would say mother. So the medial sound in mother and the final sound in mother are different depending on the dialect that you're speaking. And there's also different grammatical rules in AAE too. So in AAE, you might hear somebody say, she don't go here no more. So we have the don't and the no. We have two negatives within one sentence, which is perfectly fine in AAE, but in MAE, the speaker would say, she doesn't go here anymore. So if an SLP has never studied or had extensive experience with these phonological or grammatical rules of African American English, then they may misdiagnose the AAE speaker with a communication disorder. And this inaccurate diagnosis could potentially follow the child throughout their academic career, because at the secondary level, you know, we're talking middle school and high school, this oral language disorder may be perceived as a written language disorder. And then the student is mislabeled again as having a learning disability, which leads to a second diagnosis within the special education system. So the misdiagnosis of these Black children with oral and written language disorders is a systemic issue. And that's what I really enjoy studying and learning more about and advocating for.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think both Emmanuel and Courtney, like in their responses, highlight so much about how our identity is impacted by like the legacies of speech and language and how it's perceived in like mainstream cultures and like the political legacies of our context. And I wanted to ask Professor Eva if they could share, reflecting on your research, the use of language for racialization and what are the impact this has on the relationships we have with our own self-identity.
Yeah, so I'll start with the self-identity piece and work back to the use of language for racialization. On that question, the first thing that comes to mind is the quote by Audre Lorde: "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." And I think about the multiple ways that the peoples of the Black diaspora fight for that right of self-determination in the midst of contemporary and historical fantasies of Blackness. The ways that we resist pre-existing racist and colonial meanings ascribed to people of African descent and insist on the right to the full spectrum of our own humanity, to the beautiful and complex kaleidoscopes that comprise the Black diaspora. To name oneself and to craft one's own story in the midst of so many competing narratives is itself an act of resistance. With respect to the use of language for racialization, sociocultural linguistic scholars have argued that language plays a central role in the construction, maintenance, and transformation of racial and ethnic identities. Moreover, in the process of racialization, language performs critical functions such as supplying the words used to designate racial categories, facilitating the discourses that construct and reify racial ideas, and serving as a medium through which speakers enact racial identity and belonging. In my own work, I've examined the relationship between language and racial logics in the Dominican Republic by tracing racial categories, discourses, and hierarchies from the colonial period to the present day, exploring both the physical and social information that racial language carries. I've also found myself inadvertently grappling with racial questions while collecting biographical data for research projects in Mexico, Cuba, and Equatorial Guinea. People invariably asked me, "What do you mean by race?" And my response was always, "Tell me what it means to you." And in the process, I found myself learning about the many different ways that race was constructed across these diverse spaces. Even when the language that we use to identify ourselves was many times forced on us and our ancestors through the violent erasures inherent in the processes of colonization and enslavement, even when the labels that we claim and take up were initially assigned to us by others, I'm reminded of a bell hooks piece that quotes poet Adrienne Rich: "This is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you." Hooks says, within Western metaphysical dualistic thought, ideas are always more important than language. To heal the splitting of mind and body, marginalized and oppressed people attempt to recover ourselves and our experiences in language. We seek to make a place for intimacy. Unable to find such a place in standard English, we create the ruptured, broken, unruly speech of the vernacular. When I need to say words that do more than simply mirror and or address the dominant reality, I speak Black vernacular. There, in that location, we make English, and by extension, other colonial languages, do what we want them to do. We take the oppressor's language and turn it against itself. We make our words a counter-hegemonic speech, liberating ourselves in language.
Wow, thank you. That was really beautiful, how you ended your response, and it's bringing me to think about the question I'd like to ask Tarcizio, and regarding the concept of Americanity. Sorry, my dyslexia is working again. So in our conversation prior to the panel, we were talking about the conceptual contributions by Leila Gonzalez and the ways in which Americanity both impacts your work and also the identities of the people that you work with. Love for you to share your thoughts on that.
Thank you for the excellent question, Hillary. This idea of Americanity is a political and cultural category proposed by Leila Gonzalez, a great intellectual that published a lot of production during the 80s to recognize and centralize what she called Americans, the peoples of the Black diaspora in the continent called Latin America, especially Brazil, from her point of view. And she also developed a category called Portuguese. It's like the mixing of Black, preto in Portuguese, and Portuguese, because as the Afro-American vernacular English, there are a specific way of talking in Brazil by Black people, and specifically in some regions, that it's very underestimated by the central power, and the hegemonic knowledge. So in the words of Leila Gonzalez, she said the following: "We are tired of knowing that not even the books where we adults to study speak of the effective contribution of the popular classes, women, Black people, and indigenous people in our historical and cultural formation of the country. In fact, what is done is to folklorize all of them, to folklorize the minorities. And what is left? It's left only the impression that only men, especially white men, socially and economically privileged, were the only ones to build this country. So this triple I is called sexism, racism, and elitism, a specific idea of intersectionality. So we are trying to use this inspiration by Leila Gonzalez to think about digital technologies and how epistemicide and the erasure of Black knowledge, as Emmanuel said, it's one thing that we need to fight against in Brazil. We developed a small survey on that and talked with 113 Black technology experts in Brazil, and most of them pointed out the epistemicide and erasure of Black knowledge, and this is so much related to language. So from zero rating and net neutrality to facial recognition, there is a need to centralize the struggle of Black Brazilian people to better develop and to regulate technology in Brazil.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the response. And I think it was really powerful that you highlighted the experiences of it, and I start to pronounce the word incorrectly. Parasite. No, I was saying it. Is the merger of epistemology and side, but I can't pronounce the words together because I'm now struggling. Could you pronounce it again, please? Sorry, because I.
Oh, sure. Yeah. In around the idea of epistemicide, I'm not sure if it's the correct
no,
you're saying English. Yeah.
You're saying it correctly, just that I struggle at times to speak. But anyway, would you call it an epistemicide? The ways in which, I think that was a really powerful point, and it kind of relates to a question that I want to ask Dr. Francesca. So they recently wrote a book on the digital lives of Black women in Britain. And in your book, you mentioned a quote from Toni Morrison about, and the quote says, "Far from our original expectations of increased intimacy and broader knowledge, routine media presentations deploy images and languages that narrow our view of what humans look like, or ought to look like, and what, in fact, we are like." I wanted to ask you, how do Black women exist to resist weaponized language used in media?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And I've just been listening to all that everybody's been so generously sharing. So I wanted to try and pick up on some of the comments to do with cultural memory and intimacy in relation to this. So that notion of existing to resist, it's something that I've thought a lot about. In a way, it's perhaps a provocation, because I think, of course, the lives beyond just the mere existence of Black women involves so much more than forms of resistance. But also we need to recognise the many ways that Black women do take part in forms of resistance on a daily level, on a collective level, and as part of forms of transnational solidarity. So when thinking about this and the media experiences of Black women in Britain, specifically the digital media experiences of Black women in Britain, I've thought a lot about how I see different people, and I'm lucky enough to be a part of various spaces where individuals are trying to create a sense of intimacy and collectiveness that moves beyond what is available in the mainstream media and marketplace setting that they're dealing with. And one of the projects I've been involved in for a number of years focuses on Black history and Black lives in Scotland, where I lived for 20 years and was born. And there are so many examples of the cultural erasure of Black people's experiences in Scotland, as well as this myth of Scottish exceptionalism, where Scotland is framed as being somewhere that is so-called less racist than elsewhere. So for me, what I see in digital spaces is Black people creating content that's absent, archiving experiences, the role of intergenerational oral histories, which I have been able to be involved in as part of this work. And just thinking about the fact that those forms of intimacy, those forms of collective resistance, and those forms of joy, pleasure, they do exist, and they often actively exist beyond the gaze of the mainstream media, the mainstream marketplace contexts that don't engage with Black people's experiences in a meaningful and nuanced way.
Yeah, and that is really powerful with what you just shared about like the ways in which people are like creating space for like intimacy, and like I'm reminded of like Ethel's Club and some of the work that they're doing with Somewhere Good to Go as well for like POC people of color, and like thank you. So I want to move on to kind of like a next segment of the panel, focusing on the present, because I feel like the panelists have done an amazing job in like setting down the foundations of like the beautiful and vast experiences of the Black diaspora, but also like the ways in which they're interconnected. So I have a question for Professor Eva. What roles do academic and technology institutions play in enabling or disempowering Black diaspora knowledge production? I'm particularly interested in like some of the work you're doing on like literature and film. I'd love to hear a bit more as well.
So although academic and technological institutions certainly have their differences, I would offer the same critique for both when it comes to enabling or disempowering Black diaspora knowledge production, and that is representation. So representation has implications for what information is presented and how, which perspectives are taken into account, and who gets to see themselves, their history, and their ways of knowing reflected in institutional decision-making. Institutional histories and structures being what they are, however, the status quo with respect to knowledge production by and about the Black diaspora has been omission, misrepresentation, and or erasure. But whenever we speak about oppression, we must also speak about resistance. That's what I tell my students. One of my fields is Black studies, and it is our objective to fill in the gaps, to supply more accurate accounts of past and present events, to provide knowledge and data about African descended peoples that are usually misrepresented or omitted from the historical record, and to aid in the development of remedies for the problems that we identify. And I thank Alan Colon for that description. So I currently teach at what we describe in the US as a predominantly white institution. And when I came on board, the team in Black Studies told me, it will be a fight, but you will not have to fight alone. The people of the Black diaspora engaged in a global struggle with local particularities. And I credit Lauren Collins at the New Yorker for that language. So whether it's in academia, technology, media, etc., the push for diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging will always be a fight, but you will not have to fight alone. And so on the question of how Black diasporas can authentically connect, I think about the context that inspired my When Black Stories Go Global project. Among other precipitating events, on May 25th, 2020, a Minneapolis police officer killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck for more than 9 minutes. And this event sparked protests around the world and served as a tipping point for individuals and institutions to examine their own relationships with race generally and with Blackness specifically. These stories resonate around the globe, not just because international audiences can translate slogans in a showing of solidarity with a cause that is ours, but rather, these stories resonate because people all over the world have their own experience of inhabiting racialized bodies. They have their own experiences with police brutality, weaponized language, and state-sanctioned violence and oppression. What I found is that even when well-intentioned, things get lost in translation when we don't understand the particularities of others' stories. So as we seek authentic connection within and across Black diasporas, we have to explore the pieces of our stories that overlap and intentionally engage the pieces that do not. So at the same time that we speak the names of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we also speak the names of Mark Duggan and Stephen Lawrence from the UK. We speak the name of Adama Traoré from France. We speak Marielle Franco from Brazil and Moise Kabagambe, and the countless other sacred names that connect us. sorry, trying to make sure that I stop at my time, but that's the idea essentially, that our stories have always been in conversation. And what happens when we don't understand and connect is that we don't understand the other person's story, and particularly within the diaspora, that seems like a site for building solidarity is sharing those stories and getting to know the stories of others through literature, film, conversations, etc.
Thank you. And thank you so much for honoring the lives of people that have experienced police brutality and violence, and like, thank you. And one of the things, like following up of what Professor Eva was sharing, is about like the importance of like film and culture as a mechanism of like communicating who we are. And I have a question for Dr. Francesca, which is, cultural workers play a role in documenting aspects of languages and cultures. Reflecting on your research on how cultural workers negotiate racism in the digital age, what do you think are the key factors informing harm reduction for Black people?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think when thinking about that question, one of the first things that comes to mind is just the focus on visibility that can so often be a part of many aspects of society. And whether it's the creative and cultural industries, education, so many different spaces involve discussions of visibility, which is an important thing to think critically about and engage with. But as part of the work that I've done recently to do with the creative and cultural industries here, and my longer term projects focusing on the media experiences of Black women in Britain, something that comes up time and time again is how institutions push for Black women to be made visible. And they speak about amplifying Black women's voices, but they don't think in any meaningful way about the impact of being visible, the different forms of abuse, the different forms of harassment that individuals are exposed to. There's no real mechanism in place. There's no real care offered for those who are asked to become so visible in these different settings. So when it comes to creativity and cultural production, there's so much about that, Black creativity and Black cultural production that excites me. And that includes times when we see people actively create spaces and produce material, play with ideas in ways that are so incredibly imaginative, but which also involve the maintenance of boundaries. And what I mean by that is people choosing different moments in time when they do or don't find that they want to share something, reveal something, and make themselves visible or play with opacity. And I think this really connects to intimacy and cultural memory as well. I had a conversation with a friend recently who spoke about how often people will say, there's nothing out there to do with the experiences of Black people in Scotland. The archives don't exist, the material doesn't exist. And here I'm thinking about Stuart Hall's work on the Living Archive. And the reality is so much of this stuff is ever present. It's always there. But just because it's not visible or legible to everybody doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and doesn't mean that it needs to be made visible, legible, and available to everyone. So I think to sort of wrap that up, for me, when I'm thinking about Black creativity and cultural production, I'm often really thinking about what's happening at a very regional and local level between small scale communities, but also involves forms of international solidarity, also involves times when there is Black diasporic kinship that transcends different countries, different spaces, but doesn't involve Black people feeling as though they have to share some element of their lives and who they are in a way that's at odds with their politics and at odds with their health and well-being and liberationist goals.
Amen. 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 That's what I can say. Because oh God, listening to this panel has been so therapeutic. I know I'm hosting it, but just hearing what you just said, oh my God, it resonated with me so much. So I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Emmanuel regarding their work on Bassa language revitalization. So how are communities in your local context working to reclaim I'll use the term ancestral languages as you used that before. I'd really love if you could share with the panel and our audience your work regarding that.
Yeah, sure. I want to share my experience, but first, Eva just mentioned the issue of knowledge production, and one of the problems that we are having in post-colonial settings is the legacy of the cultural and of the cognitive frameworks in which we are trying to make sense of our world. And one of these cognitive frameworks relates to the concept that we use. I would prefer to use the notion of language nostalgia instead of language reclamation, because you reclaim something that you value. And I've just mentioned to you that we do not so much value our languages. So talking specifically about the work I'm doing, because I am training teachers of indigenous languages. So I think the work we are doing, we are doing it together. I have many colleagues who are really committed. So we are trying to do, what we are doing is really symbolic. So we are trying to keep, the memory of what we think we should be, of our identity, so that it doesn't die away. And we have to struggle with different, I would say, with different, not enemies, but with different factors. Of course, we have the colonial legacy, but now we're having government who do not support, the efforts of language revitalization. And this is very glaring in the case of Cameroon, where little support is being provided by the government. So I think the onus is on the communities to really stand up and take action. But now the problem is that these communities are, most of the case, very small communities, very low resourced, with very little equipment. So I think we should try to network. We should try to talk to each other within the Black diaspora, so that we can share our experiences, we can share our perspective, and we can assist each other where needed. And we are relying very much on technology. Luckily, now we are able to speak, even though we are not sitting next to one another, thanks to technology. So we are betting on technology to try to recreate the world that we think is ours, so that even though our children cannot experience the reality that works with our language, at least we can be able to recreate it, so that while trying to cope with resisting to cultural erasure, we can be making sense of the world through these virtual realities that we can create with technology.
Thank you. And did you say you wanted to show your screen? I didn't know if you still wanted to do that. Sorry, Emmanuel. You're on mute.
Sorry?
Sorry, I thought you meant in the beginning of your when you were talking, did you say you wanted to share your screen as well, or I don't know?
No, maybe it's
okay. Sorry,
it's my spelling here.
Oh no. It was I misheard. I'm so sorry, but I think thank you so much for sharing in your response about like language nostalgia and like reclaiming like what we have and like the impact of erasure through like both like governmental and post-colonial legacies, and like the importance of like connecting to the Black diaspora. And that does tie to the last question I want to ask the panel, but not just yet. I do want to remind the audience, if you do have questions for the panel, we're going to have a Q&A section towards the end. You can ask a question on the diversity channel on Slack. Just like write the question in the chat and I will bring it towards the panel. Cool. So for the next few questions, I would like to ask Tarcizio, why is it important that digital literacy and technology developments should think further than translation of high resource text and image objects? Just a bit of context. Some languages on the internet are seen as high and low resource. So audience, this is an explainer for the audience. High resource languages are like languages such as English. A low resource language be seen as a language such as Taiwanese. But yeah, Tarcizio, please share your thoughts.
Oh, thank you. Well, I really like the idea of viewing digital technologies through the lenses of recovery and connection and their potentials to allow some minorities or disadvantaged groups to recover knowledge and recover connections, like the cultural memory mapping or recording that Professor Francesca mentioned. But on the other hand, colonial and neoliberal logics of profit accumulation, positivism, and ideas of universal knowledge create barriers for the liberating potential of the open web. So how, in my opinion, can the Black diaspora deal with this? I believe that navigating through the details of our differences and similarities that scape the potential of the scale and the planning and the planification of the world, because not everything has to be scaled, and in an open web we don't have to literally tag everything. So one example I really like to do is the following. In some workshops about large language models or about large image tagging models for machine learning, I usually ask participants to upload images of regional dishes, for example, regional dishes from Bahia, to Google Vision APIs. And a lot of computer vision APIs like Google Vision or IBM Watson and alike. So a lot of computer vision APIs does not understand some dishes from Bahia, the blackest country in Brazil, that has a lot of specific dishes and foods with some influence from West Africa due to the African descendants in Bahia. So one thing that is really interesting to discuss on those occasions is the following. We should correct the models so the computer vision APIs could understand everything about Bahia, for example, or should we use the internet potential to do a different thing in a small scale possibility? For example, to connect people from Bahia, chefs from Bahia that knows how to do acarajé, for example, to discuss with people from West Africa that cook akara. It's a similar dish with the same origin from West Africa countries like Ghana, for example. So I really think that this idea of high resource texts or resources, it's something important, but on the other hand, to have a healthier internet for the Black diaspora, we should also look for infrastructure and some old school techniques to use the internet to connect people, and not just to feed machine learning models.
Thank you. And tying, like, just following a thread of what you shared about like using the internet to connect people, technology at times is used to support people that are like neurodivergent as they navigate the web. And I want to ask a question of Courtney, reflecting on their work on like speech pathologies and students, what techniques or research and strategies have you used research to support Black children that have speech pathologies and neurodiverse?
Yeah, so I was the project manager of a federally funded grant at the University of Maryland, and our task was to produce computer software to successfully detect African American English features within language samples of children between the ages of about 2 and 6. The plan was, and still is, for speech language pathologists to collect a language sample, which is usually about 50 sentences of the child playing with the SLP or the parent, and input all of those sentences that the child said into this particular computer program. So this program was originally created by developers at Carnegie Mellon University, and it's called Computerized Language Analysis. So the idea is to analyze the sample in order to understand all of the linguistic structures within the child's repertoire. So if the computer program detects several African American English features, then the SLP will know that the child is an AAE speaker, which is helpful. As I said before, a lot of people don't have the training to detect these different dialects. So the computer program hopefully would solve that issue. And then the SLP would have a better understanding of how to move forward with this data. So if the computer software program detects several African American English features, as well as a number of grammatical errors within the language sample, then it's likely that the child is both an AAE speaker with a language disorder, because these two things can and do coexist. And this particular overlap is one of the most challenging aspects of being a diagnostician, because we have to answer lots of questions. Is this child presenting with the language difference, whereas they're speaking a different dialect? Or are they presenting with a language disorder where they actually have difficulty communicating? Or could it be both? Because as I said, you could be an AAE speaker, but also have a language disorder. So I'm no longer a faculty member at the University of Maryland, but I am a doctoral student at Indiana University studying literacy, culture, and language. So I continue to research these intersectionalities, and I also continue to advocate for Black children on a national level with my organization, which is called DiversitySLP. So I co-founded this organization with two SLPs, and we are on a mission to diversify the field of speech-language pathology. So we speak at local high schools here in DC, and we teach students about the profession because we want to recruit them. We want them to become SLPs of color, and we want them to learn about this amazing field. And we also conduct trainings to teach actual SLPs how to successfully diagnose and treat children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So we give them the tools to conduct alternative assessments, like collecting language samples rather than performing standardized assessments, because these standardized assessments are normed on lots of white children in the United States. So that leads to biases. And so those standardized assessments should only be used on mainstream American English speakers. So I continue to advocate for these Black children with the computer software program that I was developing at UMD, but also advocating by teaching other SLPs how to conduct these alternative assessments, because the standardized assessments are just simply not appropriate.
Yeah. Thank you so much for highlighting the work that you've been doing. And like, it sounds really beautiful. And like, especially as someone who is neurodivergent, like, and like, it's just a beautiful way in showing like the ways in which we can use technology to support young children with like language, who are Black as well, because like there are lots of gaps within like the speech pathology industry and disability in general, sometimes having a lack of the intersectionality. And I think so much for sharing that. And I just want to ask all the panelists this last question. And just before I do, if you have any questions you'd like to ask the panelists, please ask on Slack on the diversity channel. We've already got one in so far, and feel free to add your question in a bit. Anyway, so the question I'd like to ask the panel is, what ways can we build solidarity across the Black diaspora through cultural knowledge production in our various industries represented on this panel? I would like to suggest, I would say it's going in alphabetical order, but then Courtney just spoke, so I want to give her a breather. So I will go in reverse. Tarcizio, is it okay if you could share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think the solidarity between minorities around the world, Black diaspora or not, is very important for defending a healthier internet and human rights. So one example of things that are able to do that. It's the translation of resources, but not only high resource texts, but also specific problems that specific communities face around the world. So we can better understand our problems, comparing those similarities and the way that we can react. One example is that I had the opportunity to translate some articles from scholars from USA, Ghana, and Nigeria in my last edited collection that had a huge impact here in Brazil, because people can see that they face the same problems minorities in New Orleans face, for example. So this idea of translate resources is one of the pets.
Thank you. Francesca, could you respond, please?
Yeah, thanks. I think I was just thinking about all that everybody's been speaking about, and I feel as though there's this complete recognition of moments of similarity, or shared experiences, shared struggles, but also recognizing distinct differences too. So I think what I'm reflecting on in relation to that question is just the importance of learning about each other's experiences, appreciating, the difference between, the geocultural context of one place and what race means in that space, what the particular forms of structural oppression that occur there are like, and at the same time, continually coming back to the collective nature of so many of these struggles. So I think it's, for me, it's really coming back to this point about how can information be shared and made more accessible, made available in ways that aren't always, focusing on the written word, and what different formats can be drawn on as part of this, and how can there be an appreciation of all the many differences and similarities that exist and the shared histories that are inevitably a part of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'd like to ask if Professor Eva could share their response as well to what ways can we build solidarity across the Black diaspora through cultural knowledge production and various industries represented on the panel.
So I would like to echo everything that Tarcizio and Dr. Francesca already said, because those were the themes that I was seeing recurring in the things that we were saying, right? So this idea that we have to be able to connect our stories, understand the shared histories, but also acknowledge the local particularities. And it makes me think of one of the books that I was reviewing called In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. And there's one scene where one of the protagonists is in a conversation with her mother. And this book takes place in the Dominican Republic, but at the time they're attendant to the Cuban Revolution, right, that's happening. And they're noticing things are going on in Europe in the 1960s. And her mom says, "Ay, mija, you're going to fight everyone's fight, aren't you?" And the daughter responds, "It's all the same fight," right? So if we're talking about a fight for liberation, a fight for dignity, a fight for the right to our current forms of languaging, our ways of expression, and also the right to our ancestral tongues, right? We're understanding that even across these diasporic spaces where we have particularities in our histories and our language and our experience, we do have this global interest in justice, in liberation that connects us. And so the more that we're able to have conversations, and I love that phrasing that Tarcizio used about translating resources, because I think about translating in the literal sense of like translating word for word, but also translation in the sense of making stories comprehensible. So understanding that stories that happen in Brazil, stories that happen in Cameroon, stories that happen in Scotland, right? How do we make those parts of the Black experience comprehensible to Black people and others who aren't familiar with those spaces? So yeah, that idea of connecting ourselves, connecting our stories, and reclaiming our rights to the language that we use, I think is central.
Thank you. Emmanuel, could you please share your response to the question as well?
Yes, thank you very much. So I think solidarity starts when we can understand each other. But how do we understand each other if we don't understand ourselves? So one thing that we suffer in the African diaspora, the diaspora, Black diaspora in Africa, is that we have been made to believe that we are so diverse, we are so different. You know, we talk about 2,000 languages, and they say, hey, you are never going to make it. This is such a lot of work. But this happens because the notion of language has been defined by the outsider. So we have been dealing with our stories, our realities from an outsider's perspective. So we need to start telling our own story for ourselves, you know, taking the insider's perspective. In that case, we are going to be able to talk about ourselves and understand each other. And I think linguistics, because I'm linguist by training, I think there is a huge responsibility of the linguistic science in proposing an African perspective to understanding language. We don't have 2,000 languages. We are so, you know, from South Africa to Ethiopia, you know, people see the world almost the same way. So we have to dig into what makes us, into that deeper reality that connects our soul, but which is reflected in the surface by different colors, which we call languages. So I think it's very important that we start telling our story. And for that, we have to build the frameworks for telling that story, for producing our knowledge, the knowledge for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. And Courtney, could you share your response as well, please?
Sure. So I speak a lot about African American English because I am bidialectal. You know, I speak mainstream American English as I am now, but I also know how to code switch because I speak AAE with my family, with my friends. So while I do advocate a lot for AAE, we do have to remember there are also lots of other dialects that are spoken here within the United States that are related to the diaspora. So we have Spanish influenced English, you know, we have Liberian English. So there are lots of other dialects that should still be considered in a speech language pathologist's repertoire. So that's why it's so important to understand the heritage language. When you're doing assessments, the first step should always be to interact with the parents, get to know the parents, get to know how they're speaking. You can hear how they're speaking, and that can influence your assessment process so that you can come up with an accurate diagnosis. So it's best to get an understanding of the culture first, and that ties in with language. They can't be separated. Some people do home visits. In the school system, they'll go into the homes, and that will give them an even wider view because they get to see, you know, what types of artifacts, what types of food, what type of different influences are occurring in the home that are possibly being translated to the school. So it's really important to understand the diaspora and how it relates to language and culture, because as I said, these are so intertwined that they just cannot be separated.
Definitely. And thank you so much, everyone, for just like sharing and just taking the time to like just like both highlight the social cultural context of the variety of Black diasporas represented on this panel, but also like the scholarly legacies in which you build upon and like how you're implementing that within your various industries. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A section from our audience. If you have a question, please feel free to share it on the diversity channel on Mozilla Slack. If you also would rather have a question that's sent directly personally to me, I'm also open to that. So just DM me and use the @ symbol. Cool. So we do have a question from a Mozillian for Francesca. I've also added the question into the panel document, so if you want to use it for reference, it's there. So Dr. Francesca Sobande mentioned about the impact of being visible and helping protect/support people who have been asked to be visible, and the flexibility of people to come in and out of visibility through intimacy. What are the ways that organizations can provide the protection and support to people who have decided to be visible? What are the ways individuals who are listening to share this experience do to be mindful on the potential harms of being visible? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that question. I think immediately to respond to the part, what are some of the ways that organizations can work in a way which involves taking these issues seriously and trying to put things into place and provide some sense of meaningful support? And one of the first things that comes to mind is actually times when an organization is asking someone to do something that involves them being made visible in a certain way. Is that something that the person wants to do? And if, just to take for example, to take perhaps an online event as an example, does the person want to do that? Do they feel as though they can say yes or no? If the event's going to be recorded, on what terms would they like that event to be recorded? Sometimes when we speak about recording as well, the focus just goes immediately to audio and video, but there's so many different ways, especially when thinking about living Black archives, that recording or archiving can occur and take place. And I also think about so many moments when we see organizations being quick to tag somebody in a social media post, to quote something, to retweet something. Actually, this week I ended up getting some sort of trolling emails, and it didn't take very long for me to figure out that was as a result of something I participated in a while ago being reshared. And it brings up so many questions around the ethics of care that can be a part of dealing with the forms of visibility that different Black people navigate, and who's actually going to be there for them in those moments when they are confronted with abhorrent forms of abuse, harassment, and invasion in terms of their private life. I think some other things that organizations need to think about really seriously is aftercare. In what ways are you providing support for individuals who are dealing with incredibly different things, emotionally, mentally, and physically? Also, being mindful of the fact that the support that people will find most helpful can vary on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes I think organizations feel as though asking lots of questions is the answer, but the continual process of asking lots of questions and sometimes seeking sort of education from the person who's actually dealing with what's going on is part of the problem. So what resources can they bring in-house themselves? What work can they do to become more informed? And also just being mindful of the fact that somebody might choose to make themselves visible in a certain moment and afterwards decide, actually, something I did choose to share, I no longer want to be out there. How can an organization facilitate that? Visibility isn't fixed. It can be a very fluid thing. And I know as part of my teaching, I'll often speak to students about what does it mean to engage with a public social media post that then becomes private. If you saw that before, you're aware of that information. But ethically, if somebody perhaps wants to engage with that as a researcher or a writer, what happens next? What questions do you need to sit with?
Thank you for the response. And the ethics of care, yeah, very, very important. And as a follow-up question, and I'd also like to open up to the panel as we end these next 3 minutes, firstly to Francesca, but then if anyone else wants to add, is how can people who are visible in their advocacy protect themselves? And how can, and I think you've answered the second bit of how can institutions support, but I think more focusing on individuals, in particular Black people, because it's Black History Month. So, yeah. That question's for Francesca, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll keep this brief because I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. I think this is where I keep coming back to opacity, knowing the power in refusing to participate in something, or knowing the power in disengaging. I've been thinking a lot about disengagement and turning your gaze elsewhere. And I really, when I say this, I don't want to suggest as though individuals have the control or the agency to be able to just overcome structural oppression by making decisions themselves. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But I do feel as though there are times when actively removing yourself from a certain space, or actually peering into a space at a distance can be very powerful. I've been thinking a lot about the presence of silence and the statement that is made when collectively people decide not to turn up, or the statement that is made when collectively Black people bear witness. So yeah, I think I really would never want to push a neoliberal notion of self-care at all, but I think collective forms of intimacy and introspection, and knowing that sometimes Black diasporic sharing and kinship means sharing between and among, but not beyond the boundaries of certain spaces.
Thank you. And would any of the other panelists like to add just very briefly to Francesca's amazing response? If not, that's cool, because we have 1 minute-ish left. So firstly, I want to thank you so much for taking the time today, afternoon, morning, evening, because this is truly a global diasporan panel, to share and connect with us as we celebrate Black History Month. Thank you to our AV team, Andy and Alex, for the support, and Kelsey and the Black History Month panel team, in particular Xavier for helping me with this as well. So thank you, everyone, and happy Black History Month. Yeah.